This week I opened it to Nehemiah, and Nehemiah is perhaps one of the most often visited books in the Old Testament, at least from both a devotional and a practical aspect. I've even found books at Indigo on leadership that use Nehemiah as a model for good leadership. And of course, we can't read Nehemiah without the amazing lessons on prayers, particularly in the first two chapters. And so I've given you the key passages there of three prayers that are recorded in the book of Nehemiah. And there's a lot to learn there, but that's not where God has taken me in preparing a message for you this morning. So I give you those passages for your own pursuing of those topics. The topic of prayer in Nehemiah is well worth reading carefully and thinking through how he prayed and how God worked through his prayers and the effect that prayer can have in our lives. But as I was trying to come up with a sentence that would summarize what I think God is saying to us from Nehemiah, I was seeing things I hadn't seen before, and I think the reason is because I was studying Ezra and Nehemiah one after the other and together, which is really as it should be, because in the old Hebrew scrolls, when they had leather scrolls, Ezra and Nehemiah was one scroll. It was one book. Technology changes, and they started copying out the scriptures on papyrus, and they bind it up differently in pages with books with pages, and in doing that, they separated Ezra and Nehemiah into two volumes. But they're really one continuous story, and so that's helpful to look at it that way. And as I was looking at Nehemiah from that perspective, a New Testament story kept running in my mind. So I'm going to run that one for you as we begin.
So when Jesus heard what was being said, he left Judea and went back to Galilee. On his way there, he had to go through Samaria. In Samaria, he came to a town named Sychar, which was not far from the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by the trip, sat down by the well. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw some water.
Give me a drink of water.
His disciples had gone into town to buy food.
You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan. So how can you ask me for a drink?
Jews will not use the same cups and bowls that Samaritans use.
If you only knew what God gives, then who it is that is asking you for a drink, you would ask him. And he would give you a life-giving water.
Sir, you don't have a bucket and the well is deep. Where would you get that life-giving water? It was our ancestor Jacob who gave us this well. He and his children and his flocks all drank from it. You don't claim to be greater than Jacob, do you?
Those who drink this water will get thirsty again. But those who drink the water that I will give them will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give them will become in them a spring, which will provide them with life-giving water and give them eternal life.
Sir, give me that water. Then I will never be thirsty again, nor will I have to come here to draw water.
Go and call your husband and come back.
I don't have a husband.
You are right when you say you don't have a husband. You have been married to 5 men, and the man you live with now is not really your husband. You have told me the truth.
You are a prophet, sir. My Samaritan ancestors worshipped God on this mountain. But you Jews say that Jerusalem is the place where we should worship God.
Believe me, woman. The time will come when people will not worship the Father either on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans do not really know whom you worship. But we Jews know whom we worship because it is from the Jews that salvation comes. But the time is coming. And is already here, when by the power of God's Spirit people will worship the Father as he really is, offering him the true worship that he wants. God is spirit, and only by the power of his spirit can people worship him as he really is.
I know that the Messiah will come. And when he comes, he will tell us everything.
I am he. I who am talking with you.
At that moment, Jesus' disciples returned, and they were greatly surprised to find him talking with a woman. But none of them said to her, "What do you want?" or asked him, "Why are you talking with her?" Then the woman left her water jar and went back to the town.
Come and see the man who told me everything I've ever done. Could he be the Messiah?
This story of the Samaritan woman has deep roots. We want to explore some of those roots this morning as we look at Nehemiah. I want to begin at the end of Nehemiah. We always look at the prayer that Nehemiah prays at the beginning, and we learn so much about prayer and how God guides us and how God uses prayer to move even nations. And it is inspiring and it's all true, but when we get to the end of Nehemiah, we find a very different prayer. He repeats 3 times, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll read the repetition and talk a little bit about it. In Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 14, he says this, he prays, "Remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services." And you see in this prayer that Nehemiah is pleading with God that God would remember him favorably. And the reason is because Nehemiah has done something that leaders too often don't do, but Nehemiah did. And that is he put aside his advisors and his leaders and his robes, and he went as a commoner and walked throughout the area around Jerusalem and through Jerusalem. And what he had discovered, that despite the hard work that he and Ezra had done to bring about reforms and a return to the law of Moses, the people were out harvesting their fields on the Sabbath. They were working on the Sabbath, the most basic of all the commands, the one that goes all the way back to the creation story before Moses. And they were violating it. They were working on the Sabbath. And he thought, we've worked so hard, and yet it's been a failure. And he pleads with God, remember me for this, God, for my faithfulness that I have done faithfully. And then a little bit later on in the prayer, he says it again in verse 22. Remember me for this also, my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. And again, he's looking out, and now he's looked at the ideas of the purity of the people. And as we read through Ezra and then Nehemiah, we find that they had gone through this exercise in purification. And it had involved gathering the people and reading the law, particularly the laws about intermarriage. And they had found out that many people who had returned to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel had intermarried with local people. And they remembered all the stories back in the times of David and the judges and the kings where continually the people would intermarry with the Canaanites. And then those marriages would bring the foreign gods into their homes, and they'd start to worship these other gods and fall into idolatry and fall away from God. And this is exactly the reason why God had allowed the Babylonians, in fact, by God's hand the Babylonians had come and destroyed Jerusalem and taken the people into exile. So this to them was the ultimate, the biggest issue. And so they had put out this thing, and they'd gathered the people and read the law, and everyone had promised, yes, we'll purify ourselves, we'll divorce the foreign women, and we'll become pure. And then now Nehemiah had gone out among the people and found that they hadn't followed through. They were still intermarrying with the locals They were still doing this thing that he thought was so bad. And he prays, he pleads with God, remember me, God. Show mercy to me. I've been faithful. But we didn't get the results. And then in the very final words of Nehemiah, chapter 13, verse 31, he repeats it again. Remember me with favor, my God. And that's how it ends. That's how the book ends. It's a sad ending. A great leader who to this day, even business people look at him for examples of how to be a leader. People who don't even believe the Bible read his story and see in there principles that they can apply as leadership. A great leader. A great prayer. Prayers that moved emperors. Truly a man of God. A man who God was obviously with. And yet at the end of the book that bears his name, the last words are, remember me with favor, God, because I've been a failure. The purification of your people has not been the result of what I've done. I'd poured my life into this, and it didn't happen. We're not used to stories that end on such a down note, are we? But the Bible's real. It's not made up stories. It's not fairy tales. It's real stories. It's the truth. But this is a message that I think every one of us needs to hear and be encouraged by. Let's just review the story. The story that is written, many believe Ezra wrote Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, though no author is ever mentioned anywhere. It's generally assumed that one author wrote all of the stories, but Ezra being the scholar, I guess he gets the authorship ascribed to him. But in these books, in Ezra and Nehemiah, he writes 3 stories that follow the same outline. They're the same story 3 times. Different circumstances, different issues, but the same plot line, the same story. So the first story is the story of Zerubbabel. And the story of Zerubbabel begins in Babylon, and it begins with a great move of God. Where the new king, I think I can't read it on my screen, Cyrus decrees to Zerubbabel that he's to take whoever his volunteers want to go from the Hebrew people back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And so Zerubbabel makes out the call, and a large contingent of exiles come with him voluntarily, and they go to Jerusalem, and they arrive in Jerusalem, and they build the altar to God and start the sacrifices according to the Old Testament, and they lay out the foundations for the temple. And then something happens. The grandchildren of the people who were left behind when they went into exile come up to Zerubbabel with their tools and their shovels and say, "This is great. We'd like to help." And Zerubbabel essentially says, "Can you prove you're an ancestor of Abraham?" Well, no, they couldn't. You know how that works, don't you? The Babylonians were absolutely brutal in their wars. When they overtook an area, they destroyed it. And if they could, they even destroyed the farmland so people couldn't build up another civilization there. And so when the Babylonians had come and destroyed Jerusalem, they had burned the villages, they had burned the crops, they had taken the city apart stone for stone. There was nothing left. But when all the dust settled and the upper crust of all Israel had been carted off to Babylon, as in any war zone, people came down out of the mountains. People crawled out of their cellars where they'd hidden. And they tried to eke out a life for 50 years. They didn't have time to teach their children how to read and write. They didn't have any records. They couldn't keep their genealogies. They were simply trying to avoid starvation. And yes, they did intermarry with the local Canaanites. They were just all in the same situation, trying to survive. But they did tell the stories of their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when Zerubbabel returned, they wanted to join. Zerubbabel said, "No, this is going to be only for those who can prove their ancestry. And so those local people went and turned instead to opposition. And they opposed the building of the temple. Zerubbabel overcame the opposition. You can read the story in Ezra. And the temple was completed. And when the temple was completed, and according to the law of Moses, they consecrated the priests, they dedicated the temple, they read the law, they made the commitments, they started the sacrifices, they lit the candles, they put out the showbread, did everything exactly according to prescription. And the fire of the Lord's presence did not return. I already preached this message last week. That story ends with the elders weeping. The reason is because the young men who had been taken off to exile remembered the temple of Solomon with the fire and smoke of God's presence in it. Ezekiel tells the story. I'm not going to read it here today. We'll get to Ezekiel. But he tells the story of that fire leaving the temple when Jerusalem was destroyed. And the elders who remembered seeing the fire of God's presence leave the temple as they were dragged off into exile. They assumed it would return. And when it did not return, they wept. The young men who were born in Babylon didn't know the difference. And that's how Zerubbabel's story ends. Then we have Ezra's story. Ezra has a different project. He's a scholar. He's not a builder. He's not a military man. So his project, I think it's about 50 years later, is spiritual and social renewal. And it begins the same way. It begins with the Persian Empire emperor in Babylon, and God clearly leads Ezra and clearly moves the emperor's heart and takes Ezra to Jerusalem with another contingent of Hebrew exiles who are returning. And his project is spiritual and social renewal. And the same thing happens. He goes there, he starts talking about this intermarriage issue, and there's opposition. People don't want to divorce their wives. There's opposition. And so he overcomes the opposition and carries out the reform. And then in the end, we find out that the people, when they went home, didn't actually follow through. It didn't happen. So a great, glorious, God-filled beginning runs into opposition, overcomes the opposition, but then doesn't end up achieving what he thought he would achieve. I had a bunch of scriptures in here from the prophets, but we'll talk about those when we get to the prophets. The minor prophets talk about this from another perspective, and we'll revisit it. But I want to go on to Nehemiah. This is our book today. Nehemiah follows the same storyline. He's the cupbearer of the emperor Artaxerxes. And through an amazing story in the first 2 chapters of prayer and answered prayer, and the whole thing about internal prayer while you're conversing with someone, if you want to learn how to pray, just go there. And God's in it. God's clearly in it. And God sends Nehemiah's project is to rebuild the walls. The temple's been built, but the city cannot be defended against enemies. So it's to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah goes with letters from the king that all the surrounding nations are supposed to provide him with materials and stones and all of this. And it's a great work that begins. But as soon as they start building the walls, the locals around start picking up their swords and attacking. They don't want this to happen. And they manage to stop the building of the walls. And then Nehemiah, through his leadership skills and his organization, gets it done anyways. And miraculously, and in a very short amount of time, given that they were working with hand tools, they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. It's an amazing story. Nehemiah is a contemporary with Ezra. And they work on this together, Ezra on the spiritual side and Nehemiah on the physical side of the project. They overcome the opposition. The walls are built successfully. And then Ezra does this walkabout. And he finds these 3 things. He finds that the people are not keeping the law. They're working on the Sabbath. He finds that they have not become pure in their marriages, but they're still intermarried. And he finds that they are ignoring the wall. They've turned the wall into a marketplace with so many people on both sides and above and all of this that there's no way to even monitor who's coming in and out of the city, and there's no defense there anyways, though the wall was built. And he says, "Oh God, I've failed. Remember me with favor. I did what you said, didn't I? I was following your word. But it didn't happen. Remember me with favor." I don't really think you have a good reason to remember me with favor, because I don't look at myself that way. Please, God, remember me. Be gracious when you think of me. And that essentially is the end of the Old Testament narrative. Everything we read afterwards, Esther's another narrative, and there are narratives in the prophets, but we're looking back now through this story that starts with Abraham. Well, really starts with creation, but starts with Abraham and goes through Moses and on all the way through to the exile. And through the Psalms, we're looking at it again. Through the prophets, particularly, we're looking at this story from a different point of view. How are we to understand this disappointment? Well, I'm going to turn to one of the prophets to help us understand. Because the point that even Ezra recognized, as we read his prayer last week, is he recognized that though they were living in Jerusalem, they did not have a king in the line of David. So they were still slaves to the emperor that overruled them. They were still in exile, though God had graciously allowed them to return to the city of David. And this situation continues. And if you look at, I'm going to look at Ezekiel. I'm put up one graphic and read a few different verses. Ezekiel chapter 11, verse 17. Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again. They will return to it and remove all its vile image and detestable idols. I will give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. I will remove from them their hearts of stone and give them a heart of flesh. Then they will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. They will be my people, and I will be their God. And what Nehemiah is telling us is that the first half of this happened. God did return his people to Jerusalem from the nations. But the second half, the undivided heart, didn't happen. That's what he thought would happen. He thought the prophecy would come true if he built the wall and purified the people. But it didn't. Ezekiel chapter 36 speaks of this again. Verse 24. For I will take you out of the nations, I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back to your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. But it didn't happen. The first part did. The second part didn't. And Jeremiah speaks of the same things in Jeremiah 31 verse 33. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. Here Jeremiah is speaking of a new covenant. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. And as we look at this story that ends in disappointment, and these prophecies that prophesy a different ending than what we see in Nehemiah, our only option now is we got to keep reading. Obviously, the story is not over, because God's prophecies come true, but they haven't happened yet, not in their fullness. So we keep reading. We have to read through the Psalms and the wisdom and the prophets and revisit the story from that point of view and keep reading and keep understanding. And in the New Testament, we read the same thing, or it's brought to our attention. I'll just look at one verse I hope other verses are coming to your mind as you know your New Testament. I'm going to look at Hebrews chapter 8, verse 10. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 10. This is the covenant I will establish with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write them on their hearts. This is from Jeremiah. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbors or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and out of date will soon disappear. The symmetry of God's story is impressive. When we talked about this last week as well, but when Joseph took his 12 brothers to Egypt, he said to them, God will preserve a remnant from among us to return to the promised land and fulfill the covenant. And 400 years later, God, through Moses, miraculously, without the people having to lift a finger, saved them from slavery and brought them back through the law, through Mount Sinai, through the wilderness, to the promised land. And eventually put a king on the throne in the line of David, and his presence in the tabernacle and in the temple. And God dwelt among his people. But they were unfaithful. And as God promised, the exile came as a result of their unfaithfulness, of their worshiping of idols. And they went into exile. And graciously, God, about 50 years and then 70 years later, allowed some of them to come back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. But you know how long it was before the exile was over? 400 years. Same as the last time. And Jesus came, fulfilling these prophecies that were partially fulfilled in the rebuilding of Jerusalem, but completely fulfilled in this work of Jesus Christ and the sending of the Holy Spirit. Nehemiah didn't see the full picture. He thought he had failed, though he did follow God, and God clearly was with him. And he clearly did what God wanted him to do, but it didn't produce the results that he had hoped for himself. What he did not know is that God was setting up the conditions all that time before that would prepare his people for the coming of his Son. He didn't know that. But that's what was happening. God is patient beyond our patience. He starts putting the ingredients together in his recipe long before it comes to fruition. He lets the yeast grow till the time is right. There's a number of things that came together in the coming of Jesus. The people weren't stupid. Nehemiah knew. Ezra knew. Zerubbabel knew when the presence of God didn't come in fire to the temple that something wasn't right. They knew that. Interestingly enough, as I said last week, they never returned to worshiping idols, though they did intermarry, some of them. They never returned to worshiping idols. They sinned, they did bad. They didn't do that, at least not to the extent. But they did something else, which they hadn't done previous to the exile. And this isn't a story that's told in our Bibles, it's told in our history books. But it's a story that goes like this. Without God's presence in the temple, though they continued the worship, though they continued the sacrifices and did them faithfully according to the law, well, sometimes faithfully and sometimes not, as we learn in Nehemiah's story. But they did something else that they hadn't done before. They began in those days building up the tradition that when we read our New Testaments we know of as the synagogue. They started spreading the worship of God from one place to every place. And they started reading the scriptures in every village and every town. And they started teaching their children to read and write so that they could read the scriptures for themselves and ask these questions and search and understand. And wherever they went, they put up synagogues. And when Jesus came, the most literate people in an illiterate world, in other words, the people that knew how to read and write, were the followers of the Torah. Because they sent their kids to synagogue. Because they said it's important to read this book. And then the Gentile people that lived around in the New Testament, what are they called? They're everywhere Paul went. God-fearers. Those are the people who are not circumcised, but are attached to the synagogues all across the known world. And they too know the Old Testament probably better than you do. Most of you anyways. Because that's what they did. They went to synagogue and someone read a passage and explained it. And they went to synagogue and they learned to read and write. And their children learned to read and write so they could stand up in synagogue and read the next passage and try to understand it. And debate it and talk about it. Why? Is this prophecy fulfilled? Is that one not? What is happening? When will the days of Jeremiah come to be? When we'll receive these new hearts? The days of Ezekiel, when the hearts of stone will be turned to hearts of flesh. The situation between the locals and the pure stock was still in place 400 years later. The Samaritans were the descendants of the opposition. The ones who came, can we help? No, you're not pure enough. Rejected. They were still being rejected when Jesus came. They were known in the Roman world as Samaritans. They still were telling their children the stories of Jacob. This well your ancestor Jacob drank at. You can't go to that temple, they won't let you. But this is your God. They were still telling the stories. During that time, in the years in between, the history books tell us that there was many men who stood up with their sword and their shield and their spear and rallied men around them and said, I'm a descendant of David. I'm the new king. If you follow me, the Romans or the Greeks or the Persians will be destroyed. And the kingdom will return and the presence of God will return to the temple. Time and again, the history books tell us, these men arose. People joined them and they were slaughtered. And the people, when Jesus came, were tired of those kind of leaders. And they saw in him a different kind of leader. And they followed him. And this is what it says in Galatians. These little phrases that if we don't read our Old Testament, we miss the full meaning. But when the right time had come. Man, you can read that fast, can't you? When the right time, let's get on to the good stuff. God sent his son. We might as well just leave off the first part and just start with God sent his son. No. When God sent Nehemiah to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall, he was setting up the conditions that would result in the right time. He was putting in motion the historical processes that with patience and with grace and with mercy and with time and with continued presence of God with his people would bring about the right time. The right time for Jesus. When the right time had come. How do you know it's the right time? Read the Old Testament. Feel the disappointment of Nehemiah when it didn't happen and he thought it would. God was setting up the right time. Nehemiah, he followed God faithfully. He did not do wrong. But he looked at his life and he thought it was a failure. Oh God, remember me with favor. But God knew what he was doing. He was setting up the right time. But when the right time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman, subject to the law. See, the law had to be in place for it to be the right time. God sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves to the law, so that he might adopt us as his very own children. And because we are his children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, prompting us to call out, Abba, Father. Just like Ezekiel said, a new spirit that will turn hearts of stone to hearts of flesh. And a spirit that would provide the power and strength to live holy lives. Now you are no longer a slave, but God's own child. And since you are his child, God has made you his heir. We read that word slave, and we assume rightly that it means a slave to our sins, a slave to our temptations, and that God's Spirit can free us from that. And that's true, but it's so much more. Because God's people had been still slaves to foreign kings from the time of Nehemiah till the time of Jesus. And so when Paul says in Galatians, Jesus sets you free from this slavery, he's saying the prophecies are now fulfilled. The time has come. The new covenant that you've been waiting for, that you've been longing for all this time. Just like the people in Egypt waited for 400 years to return to the land of promise, so too the people waited 400 years for the promised Redeemer, Messiah, who would come and end the exile and make them God's people again. And God would live among them, but this time not in a temple made of stone, but a temple of living stones in the hearts of men and women. And when that reality came to life among the followers of Jesus, quickly they were persecuted. Where did they go to hide from the persecution of the temple guards? They went to Samaria. And wherever they went, the people were ready to hear the message. And where did they go? They went to Corinth and Ephesus. And wherever they went, there were synagogues. And around the synagogues were Greeks who were God-fearers. And when Ezekiel says, I will gather from all the countries, they understood now that it meant truly all the countries of the world. There would be no walls around the worship of God, because the sacrifice of Jesus Christ is greater than that of sheep and goats. There would be no barriers. There would be no one who we have to say, no, you can't worship. It would be available to all. Nehemiah didn't see this. And so this is what I think for us today the message is. There's every one of these books you could write different sentences, but this is the one for us. In Nehemiah, God says, you are not a failure when you follow me, even when it does not produce what you expected. We need that encouraging word. You are not a failure when you follow me, even if it doesn't produce what you expected. It's a complicated sentence, because what does it truly mean to follow Jesus? We understand that sometimes we read the word and we think we're doing right, and then we read more of it and realize, no, that was a misinterpretation. So we have to be diligent in our study. We have to be diligent in our devotion. We have to be willing to change our course as we learn more clearly what it means to follow Jesus. But I believe the promise of that sentence, the lesson that Nehemiah was trying to learn, is still true. Nehemiah did exactly what God asked him to do. It was a miraculous, almost unbelievable triumph to get that wall built. And he thought it would produce the Messiah. And it did. Just not that week. few years later, a few hundred years later. He did right. The results he did not see. I want to close with a story. I don't know if I've told this story. I was trying to remember. I know I used this story in a board meeting for a devotional, so some of you have heard it. But I might have told this story in this church in a sermon before. So if I did, I just listen to it again. It's perfect for this message. It's an encouraging story. Dr. William Leslie. Anyone know of this man? He's not written up in the chronicles of the successful missionaries. Dr. William Leslie, in the year 1912, went to Africa as a medical missionary. He traveled to Africa and he went to basically the most remote place you could get to. In what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, he went deep in the jungle, up rivers on dugout canoes and with backpacks into the jungle. He went as far as he could go from civilization. And there he set up a medical mission. He set up a hospital. He was a doctor. And he invited the people from the surrounding jungle to come, and he would give them medicine and help them with their eyesight and their teeth or whatever they needed. And in the meantime, he would tell them the stories of Jesus and of Moses and of the Creator God. 17 years he spent. The picture is an actual picture of his hospital and his house and the mission there. After 17 years, Dr. William Leslie went home to the U.S., and he was discouraged. He believed he had failed to make an impact for Christ. In 17 years, he had not had a single convert to Jesus Christ. Not even one. As far as he knew, he healed some physical sicknesses, but as far as he knew, he had never healed the eternal sickness of even one person. He died not long after. Some think of a broken heart, though it was a heart attack. Just like Nehemiah, oh God, remember me with favor. I thought I was following you, but nothing happened. In 2010, so 80 years later, a man named Eric Ramsey and another man, Tom Cox, got a Mission Aviation Fellowship pilot to fly them as close as they could get to the place where Dr. Leslie had been. So this is 80 years afterwards, and not a single gospel missionary had been into these villages in the in-between time. Not one. They flew as close as they could get to the closest airport. They took dugout canoes up the river. They put on their backpacks and hiked another 10 miles into the jungle to the Yancey people. 80 years later, missionaries finally coming to this place again. And you know what they found? They found a cathedral that could fit 1,000 people in the jungle where there were no roads. Not a single road. You had to take airplanes and canoes and backpacks to get there. Dr. Leslie had left some French Bibles behind. And the people, because it's a modern world, people would leave the jungle and go out and learn to read and write and do whatever they were doing and get tired of life in the stress of civilization and go back into the jungle to live the simple life. And they could read now. And they would read these French Bibles, and they would read the stories and translate them to the local people. And they would read about a Creator God, and they would read about Moses, and they would read about Jesus, and they believed. And they started building a church, and they built this grand cathedral that fit 1,000 people. And people would come from all the surrounding villages to meet here and hear the stories about Jesus. And when the church was too full to seat everybody, they said, well, this is stupid. Why do we haul bricks and tin from civilization on our backs all the way here into the jungle? So they abandoned it. And they'd been reading Acts. And they thought, well, why don't we just have a church in each village? And we don't need a building to do that. We can just gather. And so they did. And so when Tom Cox and Eric Ramsey visited these villages, every village had a church, meaning a group of people who gathered together. And they had rejected their old religions, and they'd started new traditions. And instead of fighting with each other, they had choral competitions. So they composed scriptural songs in their native language, and they would practice them in their village to sing these songs, and then they would gather together and they would compete with each other to see who had the best choir. They didn't even know what a choir was. Dr. William Leslie faithfully followed God in 1912. And he did not get the results he expected. And he went home thinking, just like Nehemiah, he had been an utter failure. But he had left behind a witness and a legacy and some Bibles. And the people had simply picked up the Word of God. It had changed their hearts from stone to flesh. And they had read it and understood enough to meet Jesus in the jungle. Now, I don't know their theology. I haven't researched it to that extent, but according to these modern missionaries in 2010, they were Christian believers. You don't know the outcome of what you do. The reward is in the relationship with God. Follow Jesus. Leave the results to Him. You're not a failure when you follow me, Jesus says, even when it does not produce what you expected. That's a good message, isn't it? It's many things that I've done, many conversations I've had that I think were utter failures. Every now and then, not often, but every now and then, one of those people I had a conversation with or tried to minister to for a while, and then it just went nowhere. Every now and then I get to hear the story of what happened 10 years later, 5 years later. Most of the time I never get to know. Follow Him faithfully. Leave the results in His hands. The reward is in the relationship. You don't need a pat on the back for all the converts. It's nice, not necessary. God knows what He's doing. Follow Him faithfully. Worship team, would you help us to sing about our hope in the Lord?